After the introduction of Russian troops into Ukraine, we see that the entire world economy has turned into a battlefield, albeit one-sided, against Moscow. Although the hot conflict is ostensibly between Ukraine and Russia, with NATO playing a secondary role, the main economic hostilities are being waged directly from Washington. Never before has a full set of sanctions, listing of unwanted entities, restrictions on technology transfers, and asset freezes been assembled so quickly and on such a scale against a single adversary. This will undoubtedly give a short-term boost to unprecedented US military and economic pressure, but in the long term will prove disastrous for world trade and globalization. Simply put, it turns what was thought to be a global public good into instruments of financial or economic warfare. This has given a fresh look at the old argument, still championed by the Davos crowd or the elite gathering at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, that world trade promotes peace and good neighborliness between countries. This is in direct contrast to the rules-based international system. Increasingly, what people broadly refer to as the global economy is being turned by the US into a battlefield, in which only it has an overwhelming decisive advantage. If the US does not exercise restraint from now on, and there is little reason why it should, it will herald the end of globalization. There is every reason to believe that the US will use its newfound powers ever more forcefully, to the horror not only of its enemies, but also of its friends, allies and countries that are neutral. Why? Because you can never predict when exactly you will find yourself on the enemy's side. In the global war the US is waging with finance and technology, America's European allies, especially Germany, have been hit hard enough despite the fact that sanctions have been imposed on Russia. Whether this was the Americans' intent or just collateral damage, one can only speculate. After all, the US has long wanted Germany to reduce its dependence on Russian energy and cut its exports to China. This is the very Western unity that Washington praises. If the US does not care about the economic health of its European allies, what can keep it from further using and abusing economic technological methods of warfare? The US has cut off Russia's access to the global SWIFT system, an interbank information transfer system for financial transactions. They are also restricting China's access to advanced semiconductors through their unprecedented ability to control and monitor global supply chains. Bottlenecks in global networks, from shipping data to supply chain accounting, are becoming a new battleground. In all of this, the US has a decisive advantage. This is due in no small part to the fact that the core networks and infrastructure of the Internet run through the US. It is a similar story with the global financial dominance of the US dollar, so that all of the world's largest banking and financial institutions are forced to open branches in the US and, accordingly, are subject to US law. Let's call it network warfare, as control and monitoring of key nodes and sensors in global networks has become a battlefield, especially between China and the US. Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman, authors of a new book, Underground Empire: How America Turned the World Economy into a Weapon, has received widespread media coverage. Farrell and Newman, in a special column expressing an opposing editorial opinion in the New York Times, argue that the US Congress needs to enact new legal restrictions, regulations, and deterrent measures to prevent abuses by future American governments. The authors praised Joe Biden's team for waging network warfare with restraint, with full cooperation and consultation with allies. Well, whether this is the right use or abuse depends on the angle of view of the beholder. More and more Europeans, especially ordinary citizens suffering from a sudden increase in the cost of living, see it differently. Russia, China, and Iran, of course, see no restraint at all on the part of the United States. According to Farrell and Newman, it has taken no less than 4 presidential administrations, beginning with George W. Bush Jr.'s war on terrorism, to completely transform international institutions and infrastructure originally designed to facilitate global markets into instruments of network warfare. The restraint that the two academic researchers speak of seems to be non-existent. The newly acquired powers are predominantly executive, i.e., presidential, in nature, and when it comes to an imperial presidency, where the president has powers beyond the Constitution, such powers once acquired no longer disappear and are rarely weakened, but only expanded by future presidents. Interestingly, efforts are underway from both Republicans and Democrats to limit the president's war powers A bill to that effect was even introduced in the US Congress in late July. The president's war powers, as well as his executive power in general, increased dramatically from the Vietnam War through the administration of George W. Bush Jr., when it was discussed that the president had virtually unlimited power to declare and wage war, since tools such as sanctions, listing of unwanted entities, restrictions on technology transfers, and asset freezes are economic and technological combat measures. Any future president would argue that these are executive powers, not war powers. This is despite what we have seen within the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, where network warfare has been an integral part of the real, hot war. Farrell and Newman write in their article, "No matter how much we talk about multipolar politics, when it comes to global networks, there is only one superpower, the United States. The US empire has expanded at the same time as the rise of the imperial presidency. But if it can claim any legitimacy, it is only because America has provided public international goods for global mutual prosperity. For example, during the recent wave of globalization, which is now winding down, not least because of increasing great power rivalry. Once you turn public goods into weapons, then people will turn away from those state structures and try to create their own. If you turn the US dollar into a weapon of sanctions, it is inevitable that others will respond by de-dollarizing, even though it may take some time to put the idea into practice. When you turn the world economy into a weapon, you either destroy it or undermine its function as an engine of growth and prosperity. This is 21st century mercantilism. When hegemony ends up losing legitimacy, it is forced to rely on brute force, and that can only mean decline and destruction.